March 3rd, 1943. Bismarck Sea. Major Ed Lerner is 50 feet above the ocean, flying at 270 miles per hour straight into a wall of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. His bomber shakes. His crew is silent. In 30 seconds, he will either prove that genius and suicide are the same thing, or he will die trying. For 2 months, he practiced this maneuver in secret. Command banned it twice, called it madness. But 8 enemy ships are about to learn why some men refuse to obey. The rain came down like bullets on the morning of March 1st, 1943, turning the airstrip at Port Moresby into a river of red mud. Major Ed Lerner stood outside the operations tent, watching mechanics work on a B-25 Mitchell bomber in the downpour. He was 31 years old. He'd flown 72 combat missions, and he hadn't sunk a single ship. Not one. It wasn't for lack of trying. Lerner had done everything by the book: high-altitude bombing runs at 10,000 feet, precision formations, textbook approach angles. He'd dropped tons of ordnance into the Pacific. He'd watched his bombs fall tumbling end over end through clouds and smoke, and he'd seen them miss. Again, again, again. The ocean would erupt in white geysers around Japanese vessels, sometimes close enough to drench the decks, never close enough to matter. The math was brutal. Across the Pacific theater, Allied bombers were achieving a hit rate of less than 2% against moving ships. Out of every 100 bombs dropped from altitude 98 plunged uselessly into the sea. The Japanese knew it. They'd learned to simply maintain course and speed, trusting the ocean to swallow American ordnance, while their convoys sailed on untouched, delivering troops and supplies that would kill more Allied soldiers. Lerner pulled a cigarette from his pocket but didn't light it. The rain would have drowned it anyway. He thought about the latest intelligence report, still fresh from the briefing an hour ago. A major Japanese convoy was forming up at Rabaul, 8 transports, 8 destroyers carrying more than 7,000 troops bound for New Guinea. If they landed, they'd reinforce Japanese positions that were already bleeding the Allies white in the jungle fighting. If they landed, boys from Iowa and Texas and California would die in mud and malaria trying to dig them out again. "We have to stop them," General Kenny had said at the briefing, his finger jabbing at the map. But he hadn't said how, because nobody knew how. Not with a 2% hit rate. Not when you needed 50 bombers to maybe sink one ship. Lerner had sat in that briefing and felt something crack inside him. Not panic, something colder. A kind of crystalline clarity that comes when you realize the rules you've been following are designed to fail. He'd raised his hand. "Well, what if we don't bomb from altitude?" The room had gone quiet. Kenny had looked at him. "Explain." "What if we go in low 50 feet, release the bombs like skipping stones, let them bounce into the hull?" A captain across the table had laughed, actually laughed. "That's suicide, Lerner. You know that's been tried and banned. Twice." "I know. You'd be court-martialed just for practicing it." "I know that too." Kenny had studied him for a long moment. Finally, he'd said, "This meeting is over. Lerner, stay behind." When the tent emptied, Kenny had closed the folder in front of him and leaned back. "You're serious?" "Yes, sir." "You understand what you're proposing, 50 feet above the water at 270 miles per hour, flying straight at a destroyer that's throwing everything it has at you. One twitch of the stick and you're in the ocean. One miscalculation and your own bomb kills you." "I understand. And you think you can make it work?" Lerner had met his eyes. "I don't think I can make the old way work, sir. Not anymore. Not against 8 destroyers." Kenny had been quiet. Then he'd opened a drawer, pulled out 2 sheets of paper, and slid them across the table. They were orders from Air Force Command dated 1942 and early 1943. Both explicitly forbade low-level skip bombing. Too dangerous. Too many losses. Unacceptable risk. "I never showed you these," Kenny had said. He'd stood up, walked to the tent flap, and paused. "I'm going to be in Brisbane for the next 3 weeks, overseeing logistics. What happens in New Guinea while I'm gone is not my immediate concern." He'd glanced back. "Do you understand me, Major?" Yes, sir. Good. Don't die stupidly. Now, standing in the rain, Lerner lit the cigarette after all, cupping his hand against the wind. He had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to turn a forbidden tactic into something that might save 7,000 Allied lives by taking 7,000 Japanese ones. He walked across the muddy airstrip toward the engineering shack. Lieutenant Morrison was inside, bent over a technical manual, grease on his hands and a pencil behind his ear. He looked up when Lerner entered. "Maury, I need you to do something that'll probably get us both shot." Morrison set down the manual. "I'm listening." "I need you to take a B-25 and turn it into something it was never meant to be. I need the bombardier station stripped out. I need 850 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose. I need the bomb bay rigged for manual release at extremely low altitude. And I need all of it done quietly, because if anyone asks, we're conducting routine maintenance." Morrison whistled low. "You're talking about skip bombing." "I am." "That's been banned, Major, twice." "So I keep hearing." Morrison looked at him, then at the rain hammering on the tin roof, then back at him. "How low?" 50 feet. Jesus Christ. "Can you do it?" Morrison wiped his hands on a rag, thinking. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, I can do it. But Lerner, if this doesn't work, they're going to bury us in the same hole. If this doesn't work, Maury, we'll already be dead." The modifications took 6 days. Working at night under tarps, Morrison and his team gutted the nose of a B-25, installing a battery of forward-firing guns that turned the bomber into a flying pillbox. They recalibrated the bomb release mechanism for split-second timing. They adjusted the trim for low-altitude stability. When they were finished, the plane looked the same from a distance. Up close, it was a different beast entirely. The practice runs started on February 10th. There was a wrecked freighter called the Pruth rusting in the shallows off the coast. It became their target. Lerner and his hand-picked crew co-pilot, Lieutenant Davies navigator Sergeant Kowalski engineer Private Chen, would take off at dawn, fly out to the Pruth, and make run after run at 50 feet, releasing dummy bombs weighted to match the real thing. The first attempt nearly killed them all. Lerner came in too steep, and the plane's belly scraped the wave tops, throwing up spray that blinded them. He'd pulled up hard, the aircraft shuddering alarms, screaming. Davies had been white-knuckled on the yoke. Too low, too goddamn low. I know. The second run was too high, 70 feet, and the dummy bomb skipped wrong, veering off at an angle that would have missed a battleship. The third run, Lerner held it steady. 50 feet exactly, speed 270, release at 400 yards. The bomb left the bay, hit the water, skipped once, twice, and slammed into the Pruth's hull with a clang they could hear over the engines. Davies had let out a whoop. "Holy hell, you did it!" But one success wasn't enough. It had to be repeatable. Perfect. Every time. Because in combat, there would be no second chances. They practiced until Lerner could feel the exact altitude in his bones, until he could judge the release point by instinct, until the plane and the water and the target became one continuous equation that his hands solved without thinking. They practiced in weather, in wind, at dawn and dusk when the light played tricks. They practiced until Chen could load bombs with his eyes closed, and Davies could call out distances without instruments. They practiced until it stopped feeling like suicide and started feeling like surgery, precise, controlled, inevitable. On February 28th, intelligence confirmed the Japanese convoy had left Rabaul. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, steaming toward Leh. They'd arrive in 3 days. Lerner called his crew together that night in a tent lit by a single kerosene lamp. He didn't give them a speech. He just told them the truth. "We're going to do something tomorrow that Command thinks is impossible. Most of the Air Force thinks we're crazy. They might be right. But if we don't try, 7,000 Japanese soldiers land at Leh, and a lot of our boys die digging them out. So, we're going to fly 50 feet above the ocean straight into the teeth of destroyer fire, and we're going to sink those ships. Or, we're going to die trying." Kowalski spoke up, his voice quiet. "What are the odds, Major?" Lerner looked at him. "Honestly, I don't know. No one's done this successfully in combat before. But you think we can? I think we don't have a choice. Davies leaned forward. I'm in. Chen nodded. Me too. Kowalski took a breath. Okay, let's go skip some stones. They didn't sleep much that night. Lerner lay in his bunk, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the rain. He thought about his wife Helen back in Oregon. He'd written her a letter the day before, sealed it, and given it to the chaplain with instructions to mail it only if he didn't come back. In it, he'd tried to explain what he was about to do and why. He wasn't sure he'd succeeded. How do you explain that sometimes the only rational choice looks insane? At 0400 hours on March 3rd, they were awakened by an orderly. Major Lerner, General Kenny wants to see you. Lerner dressed quickly and walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the command tent. Kenny was there standing over a map, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. He looked like he hadn't slept either. The convoy's here, Kenny said, pointing to a spot in the Bismarck Sea. Right where we expected. Weather's clearing. You'll have visibility. He looked up. Are you ready? Lerner nodded. Yes, sir. How many planes? 9 B-25s with skip bombing capability. 13 Australian Beaufighters for low-level strafing. 16 B-17s for high-altitude support. And you're confident in the tactic? It wasn't really a question, but Lerner answered anyway. I'm confident that it's our best chance, sir. Kenny studied him. You know what happens if you fail. I'll be dead, sir. So court-martial won't be much of a concern. A ghost of a smile. And if you succeed, then maybe we've found a way to win this war. Kenny set down his coffee. He extended his hand. Lerner shook it. Good hunting, Major. And Lerner come back alive. I want to hear you explain this to the brass in person. At 0600 hours, the sun broke over Port Moresby, burning off the rain clouds. The airstrip was organized chaos planes, taxiing crews, shouting mechanics making last-minute adjustments. Lerner walked to his B-25, running his hand along the fuselage. Someone had painted a name on the nose during the night, Low Roller. Davies was already in the cockpit running through pre-flight. He grinned when he saw Lerner. Ready to make history, boss. Ready to not die anyway. They strapped in. The engines coughed, roared. One by one, the bombers rolled down the muddy strip and lifted into the morning sky. Behind them, the B-17s climbed toward altitude. To their flanks, the Australian Beaufighters formed up in tight formation. Lerner keyed the radio. All aircraft. This is Low Roller lead. Maintain formation. We'll approach from the east low and fast. Beaufighters make the first pass to draw fire. Then we go in. Remember your training. 50 feet. Don't blink. Don't think. Just fly. Static, then Davies' voice, private channel. Ed? Yeah. That thing you said about not having a choice, you know that's not true, right? We could have said no. Lerner looked out at the ocean below, glittering in the new light. Then why didn't we? Davies was quiet for a moment. Because some things are worth the risk. Yeah, Lerner said. Yeah, they are. The Bismarck Sea lay ahead, blue and empty, and waiting. Somewhere out there, 8 Japanese destroyers were sailing toward destiny, not knowing that in 1 hour, the rules of naval warfare were about to change forever. Lerner checked his altitude. 50 feet exactly. He pushed the throttle forward and flew toward the fire. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 2 hours and 17 minutes. Lerner spent most of it trying not to think. That's the thing about flying into combat, you have too much time. Time to calculate the odds. Time to imagine what a 40mm shell does to aluminum and flesh. Time to wonder if the letter you wrote your wife actually said what you meant it to say, or if it just sounded like the kind of thing men write when they know they might not come home. Davies broke the silence first. You ever think about what we'll do after what? After the war. You know, when we're not doing this anymore. Lerner glanced at him. Davies was 24 farm kid from Nebraska, hands too big for the controls, but somehow he made it work. You planning on surviving today? Hell yes. Got a girl waiting. Betty, works at the munitions plant back in Lincoln. Writes me every week. He tapped the breast pocket of his flight suit. Got her last letter right here. Don't carry that into combat. Why not? Because if you go down, they'll find it on your body and have to send it back to her with your effects. You want her reading her own words that way? Davy's face changed. He pulled the letter out, stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it into the map case behind his seat. Christ, Ed, you think about the worst things. Someone has to. But the truth was darker than that. Lerner wasn't thinking about worst-case scenarios. He was thinking about the mechanics of what they were about to do. At 50 feet, traveling at 270 miles per hour, they'd have approximately 6 seconds between bomb release and impact. In that 6 seconds, he had to pull up hard enough to avoid the blast, but not so hard that he stalled. The math was unforgiving. The margin for error was measured in inches and fractions of seconds. Behind him, Chen was rechecking the bomb bay mechanism for the 4th time. The kid was methodical that way. 19-year-old son of Chinese immigrants who ran a laundry in San Francisco, and he treated ordnance like it was his family's Sunday dishes, careful, deliberate, respectful of what could break. Chen talked to me. Bombs are good, Major. Fuses armed. Release mechanism responding clean. We're ready. You scared? A pause. Then honest, yes, sir. Good. Stay scared. Scared keeps you sharp. Kowalski called out from the navigator's station. 30 minutes to contact. Convoy should be bearing 285 degrees 12 miles out. Lerner keyed the radio. All aircraft, low roller lead. Reduce altitude to 100 feet. Viewfighters acknowledge. The Australian squadron leader came back accent thick and calm. Copy that low roller. We'll give 'em something to shoot at. You blokes just make sure you hit the bastards. Roger that. The ocean below changed color as they descended. From up high it had been abstract, almost peaceful. Down here it was real swells and foam, and the occasional whitecap that looked solid enough to shatter a propeller. Lerner felt his stomach tighten. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you're about to jump. Davies saw something first. Contact. 11 o'clock. Multiple ships. Lerner looked. At first it was just dark shapes against the horizon. Then the shapes resolved into hulls, superstructures, the distinctive profile of Japanese destroyers cutting through the water in formation. 8 transports in the center, destroyers in a protective ring around them. 16 ships total. The biggest concentration of Japanese naval power he'd seen since the war started. Jesus, Davies whispered. There's so many. Lerner's mouth was dry. He'd known the numbers, but knowing and seeing were different things. Those destroyers each carried enough anti-aircraft guns to shred a bomber in seconds. And they were about to fly straight at them at eye level, where every gun could track them, where there was no altitude to hide behind, no clouds to break up targeting solutions. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, he thought about pulling up. Taking the formation back to altitude. Bombing from 10,000 feet, like every other mission. The odds would be terrible, but at least they wouldn't be suicide. Then he thought about 7,000 Japanese soldiers landing at Leh. He thought about the intelligence reports of Allied casualties in New Guinea. He thought about the telegram that would go to some mother in Kansas. We regret to inform you that your son was killed in action while attempting to dislodge enemy forces from entrenched positions. He thought about all the boys who would die if he didn't do this. All aircraft, this is low roller lid. Begin approach. Beaufighters, you're up. The Australian fighters dove first 13 twin-engine planes, dropping to wave-top level and opening fire with their nose cannons. Tracer fire arced across the water like fatal fireworks. The Japanese convoy erupted in response, every destroyer and transport suddenly ablaze with muzzle flashes, the sky filling with black puffs of flak and streams of tracer rounds. Lerner watched the Beaufighters cut through the formation guns hammering. One took a hit, smoke trailing from its port engine, but it kept flying, kept shooting. The Japanese were firing east now, tracking the Australian planes. "That's our window. All B-25s were going in. Maintain spacing. Release on my mark." He pushed the stick forward. The altimeter unwound 80 feet 70, 60, 50. The ocean rushed up to meet them. At this altitude there was no sense of flying. It was more like being inside a bullet watching the world streak past at impossible speed. The lead destroyer saw them and tried to swing its guns around. Too slow. Lerner was already inside their firing arc, too close and too fast for the big guns to track. But the smaller caliber weapons opened up 20mm and 25mm cannons that filled the air with steel. Something hit the right wing. A hole appeared, torn metal bright against the olive drab paint. "We're hit," Davies shouted. "I know, hold steady." The transport ship filled the windscreen. Lerner could see men on deck, tiny figures running, pointing. He could see the rust on the hull, the paint peeling near the waterline. He could see everything with a horrible crystal clarity. 400 yards. 300. Chen, stand by. Standing by. 200 yards. Every instinct screamed to pull up, to turn, to do anything except fly straight at a wall of steel. 150 yards. Release, release, release. Chen hit the switch. The plane lurched upward as 2,000 pounds of ordnance left the bomb bay. Lerner hauled back on the stick, felt the G-forces slam him into his seat, felt the airframe groan and complain and hold together by sheer stubbornness. The bomb hit the water exactly where it was supposed to. It skipped once, a perfect, beautiful skip, like a stone thrown by God, and disappeared into the transport's hull just below the waterline. For a moment, nothing happened. Just silence and the roar of engines. Then the ship exploded. It wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic fireball, no slow-motion debris. It was instant and total. The hull simply came apart, a massive internal blast that lifted the entire midsection of the ship up and out, splitting the vessel in two. Men and equipment and fire vomited into the ocean. The shockwave hit Lerner's bomber so hard, the instruments rattled so hard, Davies grabbed the stick to help him maintain control. "Holy God," Kowalski breathed. "We did it. We actually did it." But there was no time to celebrate. Behind them, the other B-25s were making their runs. Lerner yanked the plane into a hard turn, trying to get clear of the blast zone, trying to give his wingmen room to attack. Another explosion, another ship breaking apart, then another. The Japanese convoy was in chaos now, ships breaking formation trying to scatter, but they were too close together and moving too fast. A destroyer tried to turn hard to port and nearly collided with a transport. Fire was everywhere. Oil slicks spreading across the water, igniting, turning the Bismarck Sea into a lake of flame. "Low roller 2, you're taking fire. Break right." Lerner looked back in time to see one of his bombers, Lieutenant Miller's plane, get stitched by anti-aircraft fire. The cockpit shattered. The plane nosed down, still flying, but mortally wounded, and plowed into the ocean at full speed. No parachutes, no survivors. Just there one moment and gone the next. "Christ, no," Davies said. "No, no, no." "Stay focused," Lerner snapped. "We're not done." But something in him had broken too. Miller had been at the practice runs. Miller had joked about naming his plane Low Expectations. Miller had a kid he'd never met born while he was overseas. And now Miller was gone, just atoms and debris spreading across the Pacific. The rage came then, cold and clean and absolute. Lerner lined up on another transport, this one already listing from a near-miss sailors abandoning ship. He should have pulled off. Should have let them go. They were already sinking. He didn't pull off. "Chen, we've got one bomb left. We're using it." "Major, they're already—" "I said we're using it." He dropped to 40 feet. The ocean was so close he could see individual waves. The transport filled his vision. He saw the faces of men in the water looking up at him. Release. The bomb skipped twice this time. It hit the transport amidships, and the explosion was different, duller, heavier. The boilers must have gone. Steam and fire erupted from every hatch and porthole. The ship didn't break apart. It just died, slowly capsizing, taking everyone still aboard down with it. Lerner pulled up and climbed, his hands shaking on the controls. Around him, the battle was ending. 8 transports were sinking or already sunk. 4 destroyers were on fire, dead in the water. The others were scattering, abandoning the convoy, running for their lives. 15 minutes. That's all it had taken. 15 minutes to kill 16 ships and thousands of men. The radio crackled. "Low roller lead, this is Beaufighter leader. Bloody magnificent, simply bloody magnificent." But Lerner didn't feel magnificent. He felt hollow. He keyed the radio. "All aircraft form up. We're going home." The flight back was worse than the flight there. Now there was nothing to distract from what they'd done. Chen sat in silence. Kowalski didn't call out waypoints. Davies just stared straight ahead, not speaking, not moving. Below them, the Bismarck Sea burned. Oil fires raged across square miles of ocean. Debris and bodies floated in clusters. Here and there, lifeboats. Men swimming. Men drowning. "Should we—" Davies started, then stopped. "Should we what?" "Nothing. Never mind." But Lerner knew what he'd been about to say. Should we call in rescue? Should we do something for the survivors? The answer was no. The answer had been decided long before this mission. The answer was written in every battle of this war, in every calculated decision to choose victory over mercy. They'd come here to stop 7,000 Japanese soldiers from reaching Leh. They'd succeeded. What happened to the ones in the water now wasn't his concern, couldn't be his concern. Because if he started thinking about them as men instead of targets, he'd never be able to do this job again. And the war wasn't over. There would be other convoys, other missions, other moments where he'd have to choose between humanity and duty. He'd just proven that when forced to choose, he'd pick duty every time. They landed at Port Moresby at 11:47 hours. 3 planes were missing, 20 men gone. The remaining bombers were shot to hellholes in wings and fuselages, hydraulic fluid leaking, one with an engine that had seized up during the landing approach. General Kenny was waiting on the tarmac. He didn't smile, didn't congratulate them. He just watched Lerner climb down from the cockpit and said, "How many is 16 ships?" "All of them." Kenny closed his eyes briefly. "Casualties. Ours or theirs?" "Both." "We lost 3 bombers, 20 men. Theirs—" Lerner looked back toward the ocean. "I don't know. Thousands. Most of them." "And the technique worked?" It wasn't a question, but Lerner answered anyway. "Yes, sir. It worked." Kenny nodded slowly. "Then you just changed the war, Major. For better or worse, you just changed everything." That night, Lerner sat outside his tent, unable to sleep. Above him, the Southern Cross blazed in the clear sky. Somewhere out in the Bismarck Sea, men were still dying, drowning in oil, burning, screaming for help that wouldn't come. He'd saved Allied lives today, hundreds, maybe thousands. That was true. He'd also discovered that he could kill with perfect efficiency when required. That was true too. And he didn't know which truth would haunt him longer. Davies found him around midnight holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Lerner and sat down without asking. They drank in silence for a while. Finally, Davies said, "Betty's letter asked me what it's like over here, what we do." "What are you going to tell her?" "I don't know. Not the truth. Can't tell her the truth." "Why not?" Davies looked at him, and in his eyes, Lerner saw the same thing he felt. "Because if I tell her what we did today, what we're capable of doing, I don't think she'd recognize me anymore. Hell, I don't think I recognize me anymore." Lerner sipped his coffee. It was bitter and perfect. "We did what we had to do." "I know. We saved lives." "I know that too." "Then what's the problem?" Davies was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. The problem is it was easy, Ed. Once we started, once we were in it, it was so goddamn easy. And I think that's what scares me most." Lerner had no answer for that. Because Davies was right. It had been easy. Point the plane. Release the bomb. Watch the ship die. Repeat. Simple. Mechanical. Efficient. They'd turned war into mathematics, and mathematics had no conscience. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was crying. One of the ground crew, maybe, who'd known one of the men they'd lost. The sound carried across the airfield, thin and broken. Lerner finished his coffee and stood up. "Get some sleep, Lieutenant. Intelligence says there's another convoy forming at Rabaul. We'll probably be flying again in 72 hours. Davies looked up at him. "And we'll do it again, just like today." "Yes. Because we have to. Because we have to." But as Lerner walked back to his tent, he knew the real truth. They'd do it again, not just because they had to. They'd do it again because they'd learned they could. Because they'd crossed a line today that couldn't be uncrossed. Because war had shown them what they were capable of, and now there was no going back to being the men they'd been before. In the end, that's what war does. It doesn't just kill bodies, it kills innocence. And standing there under the Southern Cross, listening to someone cry in the darkness, Lerner understood that he'd won a great victory today and lost something he could never name. The technique would be repeated, refined, perfected. Skip bombing would sink 200 more ships before the war ended. It would save thousands of Allied lives. But tonight, all Lerner could think about were the faces he'd seen in the water looking up at him as he came in for that final run. Men who knew they were already beaten. Men who were drowning and burning and dying. Men he'd killed anyway, because that's what the mission required. Because that's what war demanded. Because when you discover you can kill with perfect efficiency, you don't stop just because the enemy has already lost. You keep going, you finish the job, you do what needs to be done, and you live with it afterward. Somehow, impossibly, you find a way to live with it. Even though somewhere deep inside, in a place you can barely acknowledge, you know that the man who flew away from the Bismarck Sea today was not the same man who flew toward it this morning. That man had died too. Just as surely as the 20 crew members who hadn't come home. War had killed him and replaced him with something colder. Something capable of things he'd never imagined, something that could watch ships burn and men drown and call it victory. And the worst part, the part that would wake him at 3 a.m. for the rest of his life, was knowing that if ordered to do it again tomorrow, he would. Without hesitation. Without doubt. Because that's what he'd become. The killing didn't stop when the bombs did. March 4th, 1943. Dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea to reveal something the intelligence reports hadn't prepared anyone for. The water was still full of men. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Clinging to debris, floating in lifeboats, swimming toward distant shores they'd never reach. The order came down at 06:30 hours. Captain Morrison delivered it personally, walking into the mess tent where Lerner and his crew were forcing down breakfast they couldn't taste. Morrison's face was blank in that particular way that meant he hated what he was about to say. "Major, you're needed for patrol duty. PT boats are going out to sweep the area. Air support requested." Davies looked up from his coffee. "Sweep for what? We sank everything yesterday." Morrison didn't answer, didn't need to. The silence told them everything. Lerner set down his fork. "They want us to strafe survivors." "I'm just delivering orders, Major." "That's not an answer." Morrison's jaw tightened. "The order is to prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching shore. However you interpret that is between you and your conscience." He left. The tent stayed quiet. Chen was staring at his hands. Kowalski had stopped eating entirely. Davies just kept stirring his coffee around and around, like if he stirred long enough the conversation would rewind itself. Finally, Davies said, "We don't have to do this." "Yes, we do." "Ed, they're in the water. They're not a threat anymore. There's 7,000 enemy soldiers. They're drowning men. Lerner stood up. The chair scraped against the floor loud in the silence. Get to the plane. We're wheels up in 20 minutes. I'm serious, Ed. We could refuse. We could... 20 minutes, Lieutenant. That's an order. He walked out before Davies could respond, before any of them could see his hands shaking. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 40 minutes. This time, Lerner flew at 2,000 feet, high enough to see everything. The ocean was a graveyard. Oil slicks stretched for miles, rainbow patterns on the water that would have been beautiful if you didn't know what they meant. Debris fields marked where ships had gone down, and scattered among it all like seeds on dark soil were the life rafts. The PT boats were already at work. Small, fast patrol boats circling through the wreckage. Lerner watched one approach a cluster of men in the water. He watched the men wave, thinking maybe they were being rescued. He watched the machine guns open fire. The radio crackled. Air support, this is PT 114. We've got a concentration of hostiles at grid reference Delta 7. Request you make a pass. Lerner looked at the coordinates. 30 men in 2 lifeboats. He could see them clearly. Some were rowing, trying to get away. Others were just sitting too exhausted or injured to move. Roger, PT 114. We see them. He banked the plane, lined up on the lifeboats. His thumb rested on the firing button. The Tossun 50 caliber machine guns in the nose were loaded and ready. All he had to do was press. Davies' voice quiet on the intercom. Ed, please. Don't. They can't fight back. They don't even have weapons. They had weapons yesterday. They had weapons when they were killing our boys in New Guinea. They had weapons when they bombed Pearl Harbor. That's not the same, and you know it. Lerner's thumb pressed down. The guns roared. Tracer fire arced across the water. The first lifeboat splintered. Men tumbled into the ocean. Some didn't move after they hit the water. Some did thrashing, screaming sounds he couldn't hear over the engines, but could imagine perfectly. He made a second pass. Hit the second boat. Then climbed and turned away, not looking back, not wanting to see what he'd just done. Target neutralized, he reported to PT 114. His voice sounded normal, steady, like he was reporting on weather conditions. Roger that. Good shooting. We've got another group at Delta 9 if you're able. Negative. We're low on fuel. Returning to base. It was a lie. They had plenty of fuel. But Lerner was done. He'd followed the order once. He wouldn't do it again. Couldn't do it again. The flight back, no one spoke. Chen was crying silently in the back. Kowalski had his face in his hands. Davies just stared out the window, and when they landed, he climbed out of the cockpit and walked away without a word. Lerner found him an hour later sitting behind the maintenance shed holding Betty's letter. He'd retrieved it from the map case. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper. I can't write to her, Davies said. I started 3 times. I can't find the words. Lerner sat down beside him. Then don't write. Not yet. How long until yet? I don't know. Do you think we're going to hell for this? Lerner had been raised Catholic. Altar boy, Sunday Mass, the whole thing. He'd stopped believing somewhere between basic training and his 10th mission, but the lessons had stayed with him. Thou shalt not kill. The sanctity of life. The importance of mercy. If there's a hell, he said finally, it's not waiting for us after we die. It's right here, right now, living with what we've done. Davies folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. Yesterday when we sank those ships, I thought we were heroes. I thought we'd done something important. We did. Then why does it feel like we're the bad guys? Lerner didn't have an answer for that. He sat there shoulder to shoulder with his co-pilot, 2 men who'd killed more people in 2 days than most soldiers killed in entire wars, and they didn't say anything else, because there was nothing else to say. The sweeps continued for 3 more days. Other pilots flew them. Lerner grounded himself, claiming mechanical issues with his plane. No one questioned it. Morrison, who knew better, covered for him. They all understood. You could only ask men to do certain things so many times before something in them broke permanently. The official casualty reports came in on March 7th. Of the 7,000 Japanese soldiers who'd left Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 made it to shore. The rest drowned, burned, or were killed in the water. The Allies lost 41 aircraft and approximately 90 men total. From a military standpoint, it was the most successful air-sea battle in the Pacific theater. From any other standpoint, it was something else entirely. On March 10th, General Kenny called Lerner to his office. The general looked like he'd aged 5 years in a week. There were papers on his desk, commendations, medal recommendations, strategic assessments. "I'm putting you up for the Distinguished Service Cross," Kenny said. "I don't want it." "It's not about what you want, Major. It's about what the Air Force needs. We need heroes. We need the story of how you developed skip bombing and changed naval warfare. We need to pretend that what happened out there was clean and honorable and heroic." Lerner's voice was flat. "We need to tell ourselves we're the good guys." Kenny was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up one of the papers and held it out. It was a preliminary intelligence report. "Do you know what the Japanese were planning to do with those 7,000 soldiers? Reinforce Leh?" "Yes, and from Leh they were going to push south. Intelligence estimates they would have overrun our positions in New Guinea within 6 weeks. We would have lost 5,000 men, maybe more, and then they would have used New Guinea as a staging ground for attacks on Australia. I know all this. So you understand that what you did, what all of you did, saved thousands of lives. You stopped an invasion. You changed the momentum of the entire Pacific campaign." Lerner took the report, but didn't read it. "Does that make it okay, the men in the water? The ones who couldn't fight back?" "No," Kenny said quietly. "No, it doesn't make it okay. It makes it necessary. There's a difference." "Is there?" Kenny stood up and walked to the window. Outside, planes were taking off for another mission. The war ground on, indifferent to moral questions. "I can't tell you how to feel about what you've done," Kenny said. "I can only tell you that wars aren't won by men with clean consciences. They're won by men willing to make impossible choices and live with the consequences." He turned back. "You made the choice. You'll live with it. And in 10 years or 20 or 50, someone will write a book about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and they'll call you a genius. They'll teach the skip bombing technique at the War College. They'll never mention the 3 days after." Why not? Because history doesn't care about the 3 days after. History only cares about who won. Lerner left the office with the medal recommendation in his hand. He walked straight to the incinerator behind the mess tent and dropped it in. He watched the paper curl and blacken and disappear into ash. Davies found him there. He'd been promoted to captain, had his bars pinned on that morning in a ceremony Lerner had skipped. "They're sending us back to Hawaii," Davies said. "R&R, 2 weeks." "Good." "Morrison's taking over the skip bombing training program. They're teaching it to every bomber squadron in the theater." "I know. And you're being reassigned. Transport duty, flying C-47s, medical evacuation supply runs. They said you requested it." "I did." Davies kicked at the dirt. "We're not going to talk about it, are we? Any of it. What's there to talk about? Ed, we killed thousands of people. We strafed men in the water. We did things that—" He stopped, started again. "We did things that if we'd lost the war, they'd hang us for." "But we're winning," Lerner said. "So they'll give us medals instead." "That doesn't make it right." "No, it just makes it war." They stood there by the incinerator, smoke rising into the clear Pacific sky. Somewhere new pilots were learning the technique Lerner had developed. Learning to fly at 50 feet. Learning to skip bombs into enemy hulls. Learning to kill with efficiency and precision. And somewhere on beaches across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Japanese soldiers who'd survived the Bismarck Sea were telling stories about the American planes that came in so low you could see the pilots' faces, about bombers that turned ships into coffins in seconds, about the 3 days after when Mercy died in the water. Both sides would remember. Both sides would carry it. And neither side would ever speak of it honestly, because the truth was too complicated for any victory narrative. Davies pulled out his cigarettes, offered one to Lerner. They smoked in silence. Finally, Davies said, "I wrote to Betty. Told her we couldn't do letters for a while. Told her I needed time to figure out who I am now." "What did she say?" "Haven't gotten a response yet. Probably won't. Can't blame her." "You might be surprised." "Maybe." He flicked ash toward the incinerator. "You think we'll ever feel normal again?" Lerner thought about it. Thought about the nightmares that had started on March 4th and hadn't stopped. Thought about the way his hands shook when he closed his eyes and saw lifeboats breaking apart under machine gun fire. "I think normal is just something we tell ourselves we used to be," he said. "Maybe we were never normal. Maybe we just didn't know it yet." That's a hell of a thing to believe. It's a hell of a war. The transport orders came through that afternoon. Lerner would leave for Hawaii in 3 days, then report to the 433rd Troop Carrier Group, flying C-47s, hauling cargo and wounded soldiers, never carrying bombs again. Bombs. Never attacking anything again. It felt like escape. It felt like cowardice. It felt like the only way to survive without completely losing himself. On his last night at Port Moresby, Lerner walked down to the beach, the same beach where he'd stood a month ago planning the impossible. The ocean was dark and calm, nothing like the burning hell of the Bismarck Sea. Chen found him there. The kid had barely spoken since March 4th, but now he sat down beside Lerner without asking. "Sir, can I tell you something?" "You don't have to call me sir anymore, Chen. We're done." "I want to, sir." He picked up a stone and threw it into the water. "My dad, when he came to America, he told me about this Chinese proverb. He who seeks revenge should dig 2 graves. I never understood it until now. What do you understand now? That we killed them. But we died too, part of us, the part that could have been different." He threw another stone. "And I don't know if what we got in exchange was worth it." Lerner watched the ripples spread across the dark water. "Did we have a choice?" "I think about that every night, and I still don't know." They sat there until midnight, 2 men who'd helped change the course of a war, who'd developed a tactic that would be studied and replicated and celebrated, and they both knew the same truth that no one would ever put in the history books. Victory has a price. Sometimes that price is measured in enemy casualties and strategic objectives achieved. Sometimes it's measured in the parts of yourself you have to kill to keep fighting. Lerner flew out 3 days later. He'd spend the rest of the war hauling supplies and wounded men. He'd survive without firing another shot in anger. He'd go home to Helen in Oregon and try to build a normal life, and every night for the rest of his life, he'd dream about flying at 50 feet over burning water. The skip bombing technique would sink 212 Japanese ships by 1945. It would be taught at military academies for decades. It would be credited with helping to turn the tide of the Pacific War. But on the beaches and in the water around the Bismarck Sea, something else happened that March. Something that didn't make it into the official histories. A line was crossed. Not just by the men who flew those missions, but by everyone who ordered them. Everyone who celebrated them. Everyone who looked at the casualty numbers and called it success. War always crosses lines. That's what war is, the systematic crossing of every line civilization draws. But some lines once crossed change you. They change what you're capable of, what you're willing to do, what you can live with. And in the end, maybe that's the real story of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Not that we won, but what we became in the winning. The C-47 that carried Lerner away from Port Moresby on March 15, 1943, also carried 12 wounded soldiers being evacuated to Hawaii. One of them, a private named Holland, had taken shrapnel in both legs during a Japanese artillery barrage near Buna. He was 19. He kept asking the medic if he'd walk again. Lerner sat in the cockpit and tried not to listen. His new co-pilot, Lieutenant Barnes, fresh from flight school in Texas, wouldn't stop talking about how exciting it must have been to fly combat missions. "I heard you were at the Bismarck Sea battle, sir. Is it true you flew at 50 feet? Yes. And you sank how many ships personally?" "I don't remember." The report said. "I said I don't remember." Barnes went quiet after that. Smart kid. He'd learn eventually that some questions don't have answers you can live with. They landed at Hickam Field on March 17th. Holland was taken to the base hospital. The doctors said he'd keep his legs, but probably never walk without a cane. He was one of the lucky ones. Lerner spent 2 weeks in Hawaii doing nothing. The military called it rest and recuperation. He called it waiting to feel human again. It didn't work. He couldn't sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch before the dreams came. Dreams of water on fire, of faces looking up at him, of the moment between releasing a bomb and watching it skip. On March 29th, he got a letter from Helen. She'd heard about the battle from the newspapers. The articles called him a hero, said he'd revolutionized air combat tactics. She was proud of him. She couldn't wait for him to come home. He read the letter 3 times, trying to feel something. Pride, maybe. Relief. Love. Anything. But all he felt was the weight of knowing that the man she was proud of, the hero from the newspapers, wasn't the man who'd be coming home to her. Davies was in Hawaii too, staying at the same BOQ. They ran into each other at the officers' club on April 2nd. Davies had been drinking, not drunk, but working on it. "Got a letter from Betty," he said without preamble. "She said she understands why I needed space. Said she'll wait as long as it takes." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She doesn't understand. How could she? I don't even understand." "You tell her anything." "What would I tell her? That I'm a different person now, that I close my eyes and see things I can never unsee." He finished his drink and signaled for another. "The worst part is, everybody here treats us like we did something great, like we should be celebrating. We did do something great, strategically." Strategically. Davies repeated the word like it tasted bad. "That's what we call it now. Strategy, not murder, not—" He stopped, started again. "You know what I realized yesterday? In 2 days, we killed more people than most serial killers kill in their entire lives. But we get medals, and they get the electric chair. And the only difference is, we were following orders. That's not the only difference. Isn't it?" Lerner didn't answer. He couldn't. Because sometimes, late at night, when the dreams wouldn't stop, he wondered the same thing. He reported to the 433rd Troop Carrier Group on April 5th. His first mission was hauling medical supplies to Guadalcanal. No bombs, no guns. Just cargo and wounded men on the return trip. It should have felt safer. It should have felt like redemption. Instead, it felt like running away. The missions blurred together over the following months. Port Moresby to Brisbane, to Guadalcanal, to Espiritu Santo, and back again. Hauling ammunition, food, medicine, mail, bringing back the wounded and the dead. He flew 362 missions with the 433rd between April 1943 and September 1945. Every single one of them was a reminder that he was done fighting, done killing, done being the man who'd changed the war. But the war wouldn't let him go. In June 1943, he was flying medical supplies to Dobadura when he saw a squadron of B-25s heading out on a strike. They were flying in the formation he'd taught them, low and fast, heading toward the coast. He watched them disappear toward the horizon and felt something twist in his chest. Pride and shame and guilt all tangled together into something he couldn't name. 2 days later, he heard they'd sunk 3 Japanese destroyers using skip bombing. 0 losses. Perfect execution. Everything he'd proven was possible. And all he could think about was whether they'd strafed the survivors afterward. In August, Morrison caught up with him at Port Moresby during a resupply stop. Morrison had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, was running the entire skip bombing training program now. He looked tired, but satisfied the way men look when they've found purpose in war. "Lerner, good to see you." "Colonel? I heard you're doing transport work now. That's important work." "It's safe work." Morrison studied him. "You want to come back? We could use experienced pilots. The technique has evolved since March. We've refined the altitude parameters, improved the D. No. You sure it's your legacy? You should be part of... I'm sure." Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The other pilots ask about you. The ones who were there at the beginning. Davies, Chen, Kowalski. They want to know if you're okay." "What do you tell them?" "That you're flying. That you're doing your part." He paused. "But between us, Ed, are you okay?" Lerner thought about the question. Thought about the 3 hours of sleep a night. Thought about the way his hands still shook sometimes when he closed his eyes. Thought about the letter from Helen that he'd read 50 times but still hadn't answered. "I'm alive," he said finally. "That's more than a lot of people can say." "That's not what I asked." "It's the only answer I've got." Morrison left. Lerner flew back to Brisbane with a hold full of wounded soldiers. One of them, a sergeant named Kimball, had been at Leh when the Japanese convoy tried to land. He told Lerner about how close it had been, how they'd been down to their last ammunition, how they'd been sure they were going to be overrun. "Then we got word that the convoy was destroyed," Kimball said. "Every ship sunk. And we couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe we were going to live." He looked at Lerner. "I heard it was some new bombing technique, some crazy bastard who flew at 50 feet. You know anything about that, sir?" Lerner kept his eyes on the instruments. "I heard something about it. Well, whoever that pilot was, he saved my life. Saved all our lives. I hope somebody tells him that. I hope he knows." Lerner didn't respond. What could he say? That yes, he knew. That he was that pilot. That he'd saved Kimball's life by taking thousands of others. That the math worked out in the Allies' favor, but the moral arithmetic never quite balanced. That some nights he wished he'd died in the Bismarck Sea so he wouldn't have to live with what he'd survived. The war ground on. Skip bombing became standard doctrine. By December 1943, Allied bombers had sunk 63 Japanese ships using the technique. By June 1944, the number was over 100. The casualty rates were brutal. 29% of skip bombing pilots were killed. 66% were wounded at some point, but the technique worked. It worked so well that the Japanese began avoiding certain sea routes, entirely crippling their supply lines, hastening their defeat. Lerner read the reports and felt nothing. Just a hollow space where emotions should have been. In February 1945, he got another letter from Helen. This one was different, shorter. She said she understood that war changed people. She said she'd love him no matter who he was when he came home, but she needed to know, was he coming home? Really home, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. He started a response 7 times and couldn't finish it. How do you tell someone you love that you're not sure you're capable of love anymore? That the part of you that felt things deeply died, somewhere over the Bismarck Sea, and you don't know if it's ever coming back? On March 3, 1945, exactly 2 years after the battle, Davies found him again. They were both in Manila by then. Davies was still flying combat missions, now in B-29s over Japan. He'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, the ones with the highest casualty rates. Lerner understood. Some men run from what they've done. Others run toward death, hoping it'll forgive them. They sat in a bar that catered to American pilots drinking whiskey that tasted like kerosene and cost too much. 2 years, Davies said. You know what I did yesterday? I looked up the date and realized it's been exactly 2 years since we killed all those people. And you know what else I realized? What? I can't remember their faces anymore. The men in the water. I know I saw them. I know I watched them die. But when I try to picture them now, there's nothing. It's just blank. He finished his drink. I don't know if that makes me a monster or if it means I'm healing. Maybe both. You ever answer Betty's letters? Eventually. We got married last November. She came out to Hawaii. We had a ceremony at the base chapel. 45 minutes start to finish. You didn't tell me. I didn't tell anyone. Didn't seem like something to celebrate. He looked at his hands. She's pregnant. Due in July. I'm going to be a father, and I don't know if I'm capable of it. Don't know if I can love something that much after learning how easy it is to kill. You'll figure it out. Will you? Davies leaned forward. Because from where I'm sitting, Ed, we're both just going through the motions. Flying our missions, writing our letters, pretending we're still the people we were before. But we're not. We're ghosts, piloting corpses, and someday someone's going to notice. Lerner wanted to argue, wanted to tell Davies he was wrong, that they'd both be fine, that time heals all wounds. But he couldn't. Because Davies was right. They were ghosts. And they'd been ghosts since March 4th, 1943, when they learned that survival sometimes costs more than death. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Lerner was in Okinawa when he heard. There was celebrating everywhere, men cheering, crying, getting drunk, writing letters home. The nightmare was over. They'd won. They'd survived. Lerner went back to his quarters and sat on his bunk, trying to feel relief. Victory. Something. But all he felt was tired. So goddamn tired. He flew his last mission on September 2nd, bringing occupation troops into Tokyo Bay. The city was destroyed, flattened by months of firebombing. Millions of civilians dead or displaced. He looked down at the ruins and thought about cause and effect, about the chain of decisions that led from his 50-foot run over the Bismarck Sea to this moment. Had he helped end the war? Yes. Had the skip bombing technique saved Allied lives? Absolutely. Had it shortened the conflict by months, maybe years? The analysts thought so. But standing there looking at Tokyo in ruins, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd all become the thing they'd been fighting against. That in learning to kill efficiently, they'd killed something in themselves that mattered more than victory. He received his discharge papers in November 1945. No ceremony. No medals, he'd refused them all. Just a handshake from his commanding officer and a train ticket back to Oregon. Helen met him at the station in Portland on November 28th. She was 33 now, the same age as him, but she looked older. The war had aged everyone, even the ones who'd never left home. She smiled when she saw him, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. Like she wasn't sure if the man getting off the train was her husband or a stranger wearing his face. They hugged. It felt stiff, formal, like actors following a script. "Welcome home," she said. "Thanks." "How was the trip?" "Long." They drove to the small house they'd rented before the war. She'd kept it all these years, paying rent from her job at the cannery. The house was exactly as he remembered it. Same furniture, same faded wallpaper, same view of the mountains from the kitchen window. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like a museum, a preserved exhibit of the life he'd lived before the war, the man he'd been before he learned to kill at 50 feet. That night, lying in bed next to Helen, both of them awake but pretending to sleep, Lerner understood something fundamental. He'd survived the war. He'd made it home. But the man who'd left Oregon in 1941, young, idealistic, certain of right and wrong, that man was dead. He died in the Bismarck Sea, along with 7,000 Japanese soldiers and 20 American airmen, and the innocence of everyone who'd witnessed what modern war could do. The man who'd come home was someone else. Someone harder. Someone who knew that survival sometimes meant becoming the thing you'd sworn to fight against. Someone who understood that there are victories that feel like defeats, and defeats that feel like victories, and most of the time you can't tell the difference. Helen rolled over. "Ed, are you awake?" "Yes." "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What happened over there really happened. Not the newspaper version. The truth." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she probably thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he said, "We did what we had to do to win, and we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out if what we had to do was right. Do you think it was? I don't know. I honestly don't know." She reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, alive, real. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said, "however long it takes." And maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all anyone gets after war, the chance to figure it out slowly, painfully, day by day. Not forgiveness, not redemption. Just the stubborn refusal to let what you've done destroy what you might still become. Outside rain started to fall. Oregon rain, cold and clean, washing everything gray. Lerner closed his eyes and listened to it hit the roof. For the first time in 2 years and 8 months, he didn't dream of fire on water. He didn't dream of faces looking up at him. He didn't dream at all. It wasn't peace. But it was close enough to start. The nightmares didn't stop, but they changed. By 1947, Lerner wasn't dreaming of the battle itself anymore. He was dreaming of classrooms. In the dreams, he stood at a blackboard covered with equations, altitude, velocity, release angle, and young pilots took notes, their faces eager and clean. Then the blackboard would dissolve into water, and the equations would turn into bodies, and he'd wake up with Helen's hand on his shoulder, her voice pulling him back. "You were talking in your sleep again," she'd say. "What was I saying?" "Numbers, just numbers." But they both knew they weren't just numbers. They were the mathematics of death, and he'd taught them to hundreds of men who'd used them to kill thousands more. That was the thing about innovation in warfare. It didn't die when the war ended. It lived on, replicated, refined. His 50-foot run had become doctrine, was being taught at Air Force academies, was already being adapted for new aircraft and new conflicts. He'd changed warfare, and warfare didn't ask permission to keep changing. In June 1947, Lerner got a phone call from the War Department. They were compiling an official history of the Pacific Air Campaign and wanted to interview him about the development of skip bombing. He told them no. They called back twice more. He said no both times. Helen found him afterward sitting on the porch, hands shaking. "Why won't you talk to them?" she asked. "It's your story. You should tell it." "It's not my story. It's what I did. There's a difference." "I don't understand." He looked at her. They'd been married 9 years together, for 11, and sometimes he still couldn't make her understand. Not because she wasn't trying, but because you couldn't explain war to someone who hadn't lived it. The gap was unbridgeable. "If I tell them the story they want," he said slowly, "I have to leave parts out. The parts that matter. The men in the water. The 3 days after. The way it felt to discover I could kill thousands and sleep that night. And if I tell them everything, they won't use it anyway because it doesn't fit the narrative." He stood up. "So what's the point?" "The point is that people should know what you did." "People know what I did. They just don't know what it cost." She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "What did it cost, Ed? Really? Because you've been home almost 2 years, and I still don't know who you are anymore." He didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, he had too many answers, and none of them were ones she wanted to hear. In 1950, Davies came to visit. He was living in Lincoln now, working at his father-in-law's hardware store, raising 2 kids. He looked good, healthier than he'd been at the end of the war, like civilian life was agreeing with him. But when Helen went inside to make coffee and they were alone, Davies' smile faded. "I got a letter from the Air Force Museum," he said. "They want to do an exhibit about the Bismarck Sea battle. Want to interview the crew, put together oral histories. I told them no." "Me too." "Good." Davies leaned back. "You know what I can't stop thinking about? In 20 years, maybe 30, some kid is going to read about what we did in a history textbook. And it'll be sanitized. Clean. Major Lerner and his crew developed innovative skip bombing tactics that proved decisive in the Pacific theater. No mention of the men drowning and burning oil. No mention of the strafing runs. just tactics and victory. That's how history works. Doesn't make it right. No, it just makes it easier. They drank coffee in silence. Betty came out with the kids, a boy 6 and a girl 4. Both had Davy's eyes. The boy wanted to hear war stories the way kids do. Wanted to know if his dad had shot down any planes, if he'd been a hero. Davies told him about flying cargo runs, about bringing medicine to field hospitals, about the time a bird flew into his engine and he had to make an emergency landing. Safe stories, edited stories, stories that let his son think his father was brave without having to understand what bravery sometimes required. After they left, Helen said, "He seems happy." "He's pretending to be happy. There's a difference." "Aren't we all pretending?" Lerner looked at her. "Yes, but some of us are better at it than others." In 1954, Lerner got a letter from Chen. The kid, not a kid anymore. 31 years old, running his family's laundry business in San Francisco, wrote that he'd been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to make a film about skip bombing. Chen had declined to participate, but he wanted Lerner to know that the technique was still being taught, was now part of standard Air Force curriculum, and that pilots were still dying using it. "They call it the Lerner method now," Chen wrote. "I thought you should know. I also thought you should know that I still can't load a washing machine without thinking about loading bombs. Funny how the brain works. Or maybe not funny at all." Lerner wrote back. It was the first letter he'd written to any of his old crew since the war ended. He told Chen that he thought about him, sometimes wondered if he was okay. He didn't say that he also wondered if any of them were okay, or if they were all just walking wounded, too proud or too broken to admit it. Chen's response came 6 weeks later. "I don't think we're meant to be okay," he wrote. "I think we're meant to live with it. There's a difference. Being okay means forgetting. Living with it means remembering and choosing to keep going anyway. Some days I manage that, other days I don't. But I'm still here, and I think that counts for something." Lerner kept that letter. Put it in a box with his discharge papers and the medal recommendations he'd refused and the newspaper clippings Helen had saved. Evidence of a life he'd lived and couldn't quite claim as his own. In 1961, Kowalski died. Heart attack at 42. The funeral was in Chicago. Lerner flew out for it, first time he'd been in a plane since 1945. The flight made him nauseous, not from the altitude, but from the memories. Every moment in the air was a reminder of who he'd been, what he'd done. At the funeral, Kowalski's widow told Lerner that her husband had talked about him sometimes, about the missions, about how scared they'd all been, and how Lerner had held them together through sheer force of will. "He said you were the bravest man he ever knew," she said. Lerner didn't correct her, didn't tell her that bravery and recklessness are separated by outcomes, and if they'd failed, he'd have been court-martialed as a madman instead of celebrated as an innovator. He just thanked her and stood by the grave and thought about how many of them were left now. How many of the men who'd flown those missions were still alive, still carrying the weight. Not enough. Never enough. Morrison found him at the wake. The colonel was retired now, teaching at the Air War College, training a new generation of pilots in tactics that included skip bombing. He looked older, distinguished, comfortable with his legacy in a way Lerner had never been. "You should come speak at the college sometime," Morrison said. "The students would love to hear from the man who invented the technique. I didn't invent it. The Japanese tried it first in 1942. I just made it work." That's more than most people can say. Lerner looked around the room. Kowalski's friends and family, people who'd known him as a husband, a father, a neighbor. None of them knew that he'd helped develop a bombing technique that killed thousands. None of them knew what he'd seen, what he'd carried. "You want to know the truth?" Lerner said. "I don't think I made it work. I think I just got lucky. And because I got lucky, other people thought they could get lucky too. And a lot of them died trying. That's not your fault. Isn't it?" Morrison didn't answer. What could he say? They both knew that innovation in warfare comes with a body count, and you don't get to pick which side pays it. The years continued. 1965. 1970. 1975. The Vietnam War came and went, and Lerner watched young pilots on the news using tactics he'd developed, watch them fly low and fast into enemy fire. Some came home, many didn't. And every time he saw a casualty report, he wondered if any of those deaths traced back to him to that morning in March 1943, when he'd decided to try the impossible. In 1982, Helen died. Cancer fast and merciless. She was 70, he was 71, and suddenly he was alone in a way he hadn't been since before the war. They'd never had children, never quite managed to build the life they'd imagined before 1941, but they'd built something maybe not happiness but companionship, a shared understanding that some wounds don't heal, they just scar over. At her funeral, he stood by the grave and thought about how she'd spent 40 years with a man who was only half present, half alive. How she'd accepted the silences, the nightmares, the moments when he'd disappear into himself and couldn't find his way back. She'd deserved better. They both had. In 1990, the Air Force Museum opened their Pacific War exhibit. They'd built a full-scale replica of a B-25 Mitchell bomber, painted it to look like Low Roller, and installed it as the centerpiece. The placard beneath it explained the development of skip bombing, credited Major Ed Lerner, with the innovation noted that the technique had sunk 212 Japanese ships and helped turn the tide of the Pacific campaign. It didn't mention the casualty rates, didn't mention the 3 days after the battle, didn't mention that the pilot who'd flown that plane had refused every medal, avoided every interview, and spent the last half of his life trying to forget what he'd remembered too well. Davies called him when the exhibit opened. "You see the news?" "Yeah." "They made us heroes again." "They never stopped making us heroes. We just stopped believing it." "You going to go see it?" "No." "Me neither." They were both quiet for a while. Then Davies said, "I told my grandkids about the war last week. First time I ever really talked about it. They asked me what I did, and I told them I flew bombers in the Pacific. Told them about the Bismarck Sea. And you know what my grandson said?" "What?" "He said, 'Wow, Grandpa, you're famous.' And I didn't know what to say. Because I'm not famous. We're not famous. We're just old men who did terrible things for good reasons and never quite figured out if that makes it okay." "Does it?" "I don't know, Ed. I've had 47 years to think about it, and I still don't know." In 1997, on March 3rd, 54 years to the day after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Ed Lerner died in his sleep. He was 85 years old. The obituary in the Portland newspaper mentioned his military service, his innovations in air combat tactics, his survival of 72 combat missions. It was 3 paragraphs long and said nothing true. Davies flew out for the funeral. He was 81 now, walking with a cane, but he stood by the grave and gave a eulogy that the newspaper didn't print. "Ed Lerner was the bravest man I ever knew," Davies said. "Not because of what he did in the war, but because of what he did after. He lived with the weight of what we'd done. He refused to let it be sanitized or celebrated or forgotten. And he spent 54 years trying to figure out if there's such a thing as a just kill, a righteous victory, a war that doesn't destroy the people who fight it." Davies paused, wiping his eyes. He never found the answer, but he never stopped looking. And I think that matters. I think that has to matter. Chen was there too, 75 years old, still running the laundry in San Francisco. After the service, he walked up to the grave and placed something on the headstone, a photograph faded and creased. Lerner and the crew standing in front of Low Roller on March 2nd, 1943. The day before, everything changed. "I kept this for 54 years, Chen said to Davies. "Couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Couldn't bring myself to look at it either. Because every time I did, I saw the boys we were before, and I knew we could never be those boys again." "No?" Davies agreed. "We couldn't." The skip bombing technique remained in military curricula for another 20 years before being phased out as precision-guided munitions made low-altitude attacks obsolete. But its legacy persisted in the pilots who'd learned it in the history books, that taught it in the understanding that sometimes innovation comes from desperation, and desperation makes you capable of things you'd never imagine in times of peace. The Air Force Museum still displays Low Roller. Thousands of people see it every year. They read the placard, take pictures, tell their children about the brave pilots who helped win the war. None of them know that the man who flew that plane spent the rest of his life wondering if bravery and madness are just two names for the same thing. None of them know about the 3 days after, about the men in the water, about the choice between mercy and duty, and how sometimes there is no right choice, only necessary ones. None of them know that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It echoes. Through decades, through generations, through the lives of men who survived but never really came home. In 2008, a historian writing a comprehensive account of the Pacific Air Campaign tracked down the last surviving member of Lerner's crew, Davies, now 96, living in a nursing home in Nebraska. The historian wanted to interview him, wanted first-hand accounts of the skip bombing development. Davies refused. But he did say one thing on the record for history. "People think war is about winning and losing," he said. "But that's not right. War is about what you're willing to become to survive, and sometimes what you become is worse than death." Ed knew that. We all knew that. And we had to live with it anyway because the alternative was letting other people die instead. I don't know if that makes us heroes or villains, or something else entirely. I just know that in March 1943, we did something impossible, and we paid for it every day after. He died 3 months later. The last of the skip bombing crews gone. But the technique persists. In military academies and history books, in the collective memory of a war that reshaped the world. It's taught as innovation, as tactical brilliance, as the kind of creative problem-solving that wins wars. What isn't taught is the cost. The 20 American airmen who died in the battle, the 7,000 Japanese soldiers who drowned or burned, the thousands more killed in subsequent skip bombing missions, the pilots who came home but never really left the Pacific, the families who lived with men who'd seen too much and felt too little. That's the real legacy of those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea. Not the ships sunk, or the war shortened, or the tactical revolution, but the understanding that some victories are bought with pieces of your soul, and you can never get them back. Lerner knew that. He lived it. And he refused to let anyone forget it, even when forgetting would have been easier, kinder, more comfortable. Maybe that's the bravest thing he did. Not flying at 50 feet into enemy fire, not developing a technique that changed warfare, but carrying the weight of what he'd done for 54 years without complaint, without excuse, without ever pretending it was anything other than what it was. Necessary, terrible, unforgivable, and somehow impossibly human. The museum exhibit is still there. Low Roller still hangs from the ceiling, frozen in perpetual flight. Children point at it excited. Veterans salute it respectful. Historians photograph it analytical. And somewhere beneath all that, in the shadow of the plane and the silence between the words on the placard, lives the truth that Ed Lerner carried to his grave. That when you learn to kill at 50 feet, you also learn what you're capable of. And once you know that you can never unknow it, you can only choose what you do with the knowledge. He chose to remember. He chose to question. He chose to live with the weight instead of pretending it didn't exist. And maybe in the end, that's the only heroism that matters. Not the kind that wins wars, but the kind that asks afterward if winning was worth what it cost. If you believe these names deserve to be remembered, not celebrated but remembered honestly and completely, then share this story. Write a name in the comments. Ed Lerner, Davies, Chen, Kowalski, the 20 who didn't come home, the 7,000 who drowned. Remember them not as heroes or villains, but as humans who faced impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Because that's what war does. It forces us to choose. And then it forces us to live with what we chose. And the only thing worse than remembering would be to forget.